Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto and Sasuke became friends at a young age. Will Naruto's paranoia and mental instability draw Sasuke down into madness, or will Sasuke's own demons bring them both into the dark? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 16. He was used to constant aches and pains, the pain in his joints, the misery in his head. He could only remember 2 instances in his short existence when he had felt marginally alright, and that had lasted as long as it took for Sasuke or them to harass him back into misery again. So the constant burning of his leg and stomach was nothing new, merely a nuisance, an inconvenience. Naruto kept the leg slightly raised from the ground, putting as little pressure upon it as he could without it being obvious, though there was little he could do about the sight of it, and was aware that eyes occasionally fell upon it. The pants leg was split open from his upper thigh down below his knee, and the gash was revealed along the length of it. Sasuke had cleaned and bandaged it, but a stain of blood had traced the length of it so that all knew exactly how long the wound was. He glanced up from beneath his bangs to take another look at the mark on Sasuke's neck. The area around it was slightly red, and every few moments Sasuke's jaws would clench rather minutely. One who didn't know him would not even notice. But Naruto did know, and he understood that the mark sent spasms of pain through Sasuke even though his demeanor did not outwardly show it. Though he had asked where the strange mark had come from, Sasuke had not said, and he was left with a rather certain feeling that the mark would prove to be a malady in both their cases. And since he was pretty sure that Sasuke hadn't stopped somewhere and gotten a tattoo, he was left with the reasonable assumption that someone had put it there, most likely against his will. His black eyes were trained stoically on all the occupants in the room that waited along with them. Sasuke's eyes followed someone, and Naruto looked to see that they followed Sakura, who was moving up to that blonde girl she used to hang with. If anyone looked worse than him, it was probably Sakura. Half of her face was swollen, her hair had been lopped off by what must have been a kunai, and her clothes were filthy. Absolutely filthy. The blonde-haired girl's face was turning red as her mouth moved, hands flying about in outraged expressions. Her 2 teammates came up behind her, the chunky one and the one with the black hair pulled up. They looked like they wanted to avoid a confrontation, and so did Sakura, by the way she put up her hands in a gesture that seemed to tell the blonde girl to relax. Naruto didn't know. Although the girl was shouting, and he did see from behind his bangs that others were looking, he couldn't hear a lick of it. He couldn't hear anything except for the sound of them. They blotted out every sound. He had gone momentarily deaf except for them. Gara gara gara. He didn't look. He was determined not to look, to continue to stare at the blonde girl as she pointed at Sasuke in anger, her lips pulling back in a rather alarming snarl. The boy with the white puppy was approaching her in clear interest. She must be so loud. Gara 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 gara. No, he mustn't look. The dog boy seemed to listen to what the girl was saying, his expression clouding over as he threw glances in Sasuke's direction. His mouth too moved as he seemed to address Sakura. Maybe if he just looked a little, just a glance, he would look away immediately after he'd had a peek, just a little look. Naruto's eyes darted away from the blonde girl and fell on the red-headed Jinchuriki. He meant to look away as he had planned. It was just supposed to be a quick glance, nothing more, but the Sandnin was staring right back at him, and he could no longer look away. No. He didn't want to look away. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to kill him so bad. As a matter of fact, he had to do it. He had to do it like he had to breath, or he had to shower, or he had to clean. It had to be done. Things would be good if he could kill this person, and they agreed. In fact, just wanting to kill this person made him feel good. The constant pain in his head had momentarily ceased, his leg no longer throbbed with each beat of his heart, everything had a soft glow to it. If they would just let him cut his throat, let his warm blood spill over his hands. Naruto's mouth filled with saliva and his hands began to rub over one another as if he could feel the blood on them, and he was rubbing it into his skin like the lotion he had seen some girls put on. If they would just let him pluck out those green eyes, if they would just let him shove his hands into his stomach. He was wringing his fingers now, his stomach cramping harshly. He didn't feel so good now. He needed to kill this person now, and who was going to stop him? They needed him to do this, and what they wanted they. Someone grabbed his arm in a rather forceful grip, jerking him out of his wanting, causing sound to return to him, loud and intrusive, and his hands flew to his ears to temper the barrage of sound that assaulted him. "You're a crazy fuck, you hear me?" Someone was screeching, and he looked up to see that it was the blonde girl still, her face absolutely livid, and her teammate was holding her back as her blue eyes seemed to try to burn a hole into Sasuke. It was Sasuke who had him by the arm, and was pulling him toward another door, which was now open with a Chunin ushering the genin through. Eyes were on all of them. Naruto blanched and lowered his head, smoothing down his hood. He was standing out, people were looking at him. "Kill that bitch," Sasuke was muttering as he pulled him through into another room, much larger than the one that they had been holding for the last 15 minutes. They stood in front of a group of Chunin, Jonin of the candidates, and the Hokage. His headache was back, his leg and stomach hurt, his shoulders slumped as he peeked over at the Sandnin. He shouldn't have looked. But now he had to kill the Sandnin. Ever since he had first come across the Sandnin on the side of the street, the feeling had grown, now it was almost unbearable. His mind began to run wildly through scenarios in which the two of them would face off. He knew the other would be powerful, he was a Jinchuriki after all, and Naruto knew that he himself was weak, but they would help him, wouldn't they? Yes, I sighs. We will help you destro him killh I'm bleed him dry. This was an exam they were put up against others, surely by chance he would have to fight the redhead. His eyes darted up, he turned his head quickly then lowered it back to staring at the ground. He had counted 21 genin in that glance. He had read that usually the third exam had about 8 participants and no doubt there would be a preliminary round to cut down the numbers to 8. But the numbers were off. Would someone have to fight twice? As if to answer his question, he noticed that the one called Kabuto was turning away from the line and walked toward the door. The others around him looked surprised and a little disgusted. He must have quit. Naruto lowered his head back to the ground. Fine, that left it down to 2012 had to go. He just had to make it to the finals. No one would try to stop them, not even the senseis. His eyes drifted up to look at all the teachers there, looking for the Jonin with the sand mark on his hitayate, finding him standing next to a woman with red eyes and black hair. On his other side. Naruto's eyes widened and he ducked his head, heart pounding madly in his ears. The man standing next to him had long black hair pulled up in a high ponytail, pale skin, and sharp dark eyes. Change his features a bit, narrow his face, take the hair out of the ponytail, and he looked eerily similar to the man that had attacked them in the Forest of Death. Naruto smoothed down his hood and peeked out at him. Yes, he had the exact same smile too, and he was wearing a Otagaku or hitayate. It was the same man, he was sure of it. What is it, Naruto? He jumped slightly, just noticing that Nabeshin was at his side. He glanced over at Sasuke, who seemed very intent on whatever the man in front of them was saying, completely unaware that the one that attacked them was now pretending to be a Jonin. Should he warn someone? He should at least tell Sasuke, but he didn't want to attract attention by whispering, and he couldn't do the same toward Nabeshin. Later then, he decided. He would tell them during a fight, which was safest. She could barely pay attention to the words of the Jonin standing in front of them. She was too sick from the mortification that seemed to fill her up to the point of physical illness. Damn Ino. Why couldn't she mind her own business and keep her opinions to herself? What the hell is going on? Ino charged up to her, face starting to turn red. Calm down, she approached her. It's nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about? Nothing to worry about? I see him treating my best friend like shit and his other teammate like an object, and you tell me there's nothing to worry about? Sakura glanced around sickly, noticing that all the occupants of the room were now looking at them, including Sasuke, whose face remained cold and expressionless, as if Ino weren't discussing him. Naruto wasn't looking at them at all, his eyes were focused on something else entirely. Look, Sakura began. No, you look. You never used to let people walk all over you, especially not boys. Now you need to wake up and see those two for what they really are. They're crazy and they don't care about you. What happened? Sakura groaned as Kiba walked over to them, eyes curious. Sasuke is abusing his teammates. He treats them like shit. I wouldn't be surprised if he's beating them. Hey, Sakura tried to cut in, feeling anger starting to rise. He tried to attack me for standing up against him while he choked her. His own teammate. Well, this isn't much of a surprise, Kiba remarked in disdain. I've seen the way he treats Uzumaki dash. Just stay out of our business. She had finally snapped, feeling blood collect in her face. Ino paled, her blue eyes narrowing. Oh wow. She breathed. For a second, you sounded just like him. Her lips thinned. I warned you. Her eyes moved to glare behind Sakura, and she turned to see Sasuke gaze coldly at the blonde as he grabbed Naruto by the arm and yanked him toward the now open door, where a Chunin was beginning to usher them through. Most of them were still staring back at them, not wanting to miss any more of the drama that Ino had successfully brought forth. Damn her! Sakura blinked several times, glancing carefully at her teammates. Sasuke was listening intently to what the sickly Chunin was saying while Naruto was staring at the ground, most likely not hearing a word of what the man was saying. She hated that the world seemed to allow Naruto to move through it with as little attention to detail as possible. She noticed that the heel of his wounded right leg was slightly raised from the ground, and at small intervals it would lower then rise quickly as if he was constantly reminding himself that the leg was indeed injured. But his face did not change. He was standing very close to Sasuke, almost shoulder to shoulder, except that he was an inch or 3 shorter than the Uchiha. She was standing about 3.5 feet from him. There would always seem to be a barrier between them. She was nothing. They held secrets from her, like the strange kid with the brown hair and lazy eyes that had approached them right before the first exams. Or this person named Nabeshin that was occasionally referred to. She glanced around quickly but did not see the boy within the group of them. Her eyes drifted back to the blonde. God, she hated him. Her mouth filled with bile. She wished he was dead. She stopped the thought before it could go any further, it not being a particularly nice thought, and her face flushed in embarrassment over the petty wish. As if he could hear them, Naruto's head lifted and he looked over at her from behind strands of blonde hair. Those bruised blue eyes seemed to trap her. She could not look away from them. She hated that inner strength that he seemed to have, the kind that allowed him to fight despite the fact that he seemed scared of everything and everyone. She hated that he seemed to bear his injuries with a silent grace that she knew she may not have. He blinked watery eyes at her and turned to stare back at the ground, and she was released from his scrutiny. Suddenly Sasuke stiffened, his dirt-smeared face paling as his hand flew to his neck, covering the mark, his shoulders hunching under the apparent pain. Sasuke! She gasped quietly and stepped over to him. You should tell Sensei about this. You should quit before that dash. Her words died in her mouth at the look he sent her as he squeezed his neck. Naruto looked over at him, eyes gazing at Sasuke, then drifting away, seeming not to care what was causing his teammate pain. But what if something bad happens to you? Nothing good could possibly come from that mark. Sasuke's hand shot out and gripped her shoulder as he hissed in gentle undertones, "Shut your mouth." Sakura pressed her lips together as she stared back at those dark eyes. Sasuke was different, was even colder now than he was before Orochimaru had given him that mark. She was frightened. I must fight, and I won't let you or anyone else get in my way. I am an avenger. Never forget that. His eyes seemed to command her obedience. Who would help her? Not Naruto. As Sasuke released her, she saw that the hooded blonde was looking their way again, separate from the situation, an uncaring observer except, Naruto looked back at the ground before him, head lowered as usual, and from his profile she saw his bruised blue eyes dart up, looking at the platform where the Hokage and Jonin were. Sakura's eyes darted over to them, and caught what seemed like the ending of a discussion, and brief, wary glances over at Sasuke. Relief rushed through her. Of course the Hokage was aware of the situation. They would help Sasuke, they would help alleviate some of the darkness that seemed to be gathering about them. He would be more reasonable, more open to ideas, more willing to include her on things. There was no helping Uzumaki though. There are no rules to these fights, they will continue until one dies or admits defeat. I may intervene in a fight if I feel there is a clear winner. This will help reduce the body count. The sick ninja turned toward a wall, just as a square portion of it rose, revealing a flat screen. This is our electric scoreboard, which will display the matches. And without further ado, these are the participants of the first match. The board flashed and 2 names appeared. Uchiha Sasuke vs. Akadu Yayoi. Sakura's eyes darted to the older guy in the dark shades as he walked into the center of the room, then at Sasuke, who was joining him, the katana held in his right hand. If everyone will please clear the floor and head up to the second, the sickly ninja suggested after a cough. Everyone turned and headed for the staircase. Sakura spotted the red-haired sandnin named Gaara pause to gaze at something over her shoulder, and she quickly turned to see that he was looking at Naruto, who hadn't moved with the others toward the staircase. He was still looking at the floor, or seeming to. "Come on, Naruto," she said, and he turned and looked at her, his eyes glassy and distant. But he had heard her. He turned and followed after her with a limp, smoothing his hood down, his thoughts his own. As he moved to the middle of the floor, Sasuke twisted Nabeshin's katana in his hand, getting a feel for the weight, and finding it a bit heavier than his own. The weight was off to him, the blade was an inch or two longer than his own, and he fought back a grimace, wondering if he should have left it with Naruto. "Sasuke!" He looked up from the blade to see Kakashi-sensei next to him, his eye looking off at the group of genin heading up the stairs. "Don't use the Sharingan." Sasuke lowered the katana in surprise, a question about to burst from his lips. Why would Kakashi-sensei say that? But then, of course he knew. The cursed seal. So much for shutting Sakura up. You know then. The silver-haired jonin nodded. Yes. If you activate that seal it may kill you. Even now the pain in his neck seemed to increase. Yeah, he could see it doing that, but he could also see himself mastering it. If that happens, I'm going to jump in and stop the match. He began to walk away toward the stairs. Sasuke's eyes narrowed as he stared in silent contemplation at Nabeshin's blade. This left him in quite a predicament. If the cursed seal reacted to his use of chakra, then not only couldn't he use his Sharingan, but he wouldn't be able to use any jutsu as well. Akadu Yayoi stood across from him, the referee at their left. "Ready?" he asked in a rather raspy voice. Sasuke stared at his reflection in Nabeshin's blade. He would have to completely rely on it then, and once again a wave of appreciation moved through him for his dead cousin. If he had not shown them how to use the blade, he would most likely only have kunai, shuriken, and his fists to fight with. He lowered the blade and grinned at the genin across from him. "You ready?" the genin asked gruffly, expression hidden behind a cloth that hung from the bridge of his nose. Though he was a leafnin, he must have been so far removed from the age group that Sasuke was familiar with. No doubt he was as weak as his quitting teammate Yakushi. "Very," he replied. "Begin," the referee said, jumping back. Akadu immediately tossed several shuriken his way and Sasuke swung the katana, knocking them all away from him. The cursed seal sent a twinge of pain through his neck and chest at the swing, but he ignored it as Akadu rushed toward him with a fist. With his left hand Sasuke sent several of his own kunai at him, then followed them. Akadu dodged the kunai and narrowly missed a beheading, jerking his body back and planting a foot in Sasuke's stomach. The Uchiha flew back several feet and landing on the balls of his feet, skidding to a stop, managing to take a breath after it had been knocked out, feeling another surge of pain from the seal, and looked up to see that Akadu was almost on him. He jerked back, trying to give himself enough space to bring up the katana, but he was too late. Akadu grabbed him by the throat in a rather crushing grip. His hand chopped down on Sasuke's wrist as he was bringing the katana up. His fingers spasmed on the hilt, going numb, and released the weapon. Sasuke could hear it clatter to the ground noisily. But what had his attention, as he brought his knee up to Akadu's stomach, was how low his chakra reserves were becoming. Akadu gave a chuckle. "That's right. I'm draining your chakra, my own special technique. You're so pathetic." Sasuke made himself dead weight, startling his captor, who jerked forward under his weight, falling into the senbon needle Sasuke produced from his thigh pocket. Akadu jumped away, pulling the senbon from his breast with a hiss, and Sasuke was allowed to breathe. "This is it," he heard someone on the second floor say, and he looked up, searching briefly for the owner of that inquiry. All the faces looked down at him, most indifferent. Ino glared along with Kiba. Shikamaru looked bored and Naruto was staring at him with empty, tired eyes, hands gripping the railing silently. He wasn't weak, he could hold back the curse seal. All he needed was to take this guy out nice and quick, fast enough that he wouldn't be able to drain him when he made contact. Sasuke summoned his chakra, letting it run through him as he charged the other genin. Akado rushed him, left hand holding his right wrist where he was no doubt gathering chakra so that he could drain him. Sasuke put on an extra burst of speed, reaching the other more quickly, savoring the small noise of surprise Akado made as he appeared above and behind him. Sasuke swung a chakra-induced kick just below the nape of Akado's neck. There was a snap. He actually felt it reverberate through his heel, and Akado fell forward limply, but Sasuke grabbed an arm just as he felt the hot rush of the cursed seal move up his neck, and tossed the limp genin up into the air like a rag doll. As he jumped up after him, he saw out of the corner of his eyes, Kakashi-sensei take a step forward, and he remembered over the wild rush of power that the Jonin would stop the fight if the cursed seal took over. Just let me finish this, he thought, and as he kicked Akado to the ground, forced the seal back, forced the burning rush to recede, though it pained him to do so. He landed rather sloppily, his body suddenly feeling more weary than it had just before the cursed seal began to advance, and he looked up to see the referee kneeling by Akado's broken body, the genin's left arm and leg twisted in a clearly broken fashion. The referee gestured for several medic nins to come over as he straightened from his crouch and turned solemn eyes to Sasuke. Winner of first match, he called loudly. Uchiha Sasuke. Sasuke rubbed his neck and moved as calmly as he could over to Nabeshin's katana, which lay almost forgotten amongst kunai and shuriken. Impressive, Kakashi-sensei's voice came from behind him, and he jumped slightly, turning to look up at the man, who had the orange book in his hand. A medic nin approached them. Let us take care of your wounds. Sasuke sheathed Nabeshin's blade and shook his head. Don't bother, you should pay more attention to Akado. At this the medic looked surprised, and his dark eyes darted to where the other medics were placing Akado in the stretcher. The medic looked back at him, then at Kakashi-sensei, before walking away to the others. Sasuke frowned, then felt his expression go blank as the medic simply pulled the sheet over Akado's head and body, and they silently carried him out of the room. He had killed him. My second kill, he thought, feeling some unknown emotion flow through him. He glanced up at the other genin, and saw that most were either looking at him in silent contemplation, or staring in silent shock after the body. Naruto was staring after Akado's body too, looking his usual miserable, but then his blue eyes darted over to someone else, and Sasuke realized that he was staring at Gaara again. Naruto's hands, which had been gripping the metal railing, began to twist and wring at it as he and the sand nin stared at one another. A funny expression was starting to morph on the blonde's face, one Sasuke didn't like, and he headed for the stairs, only to have Kakashi-sensei's heavy hand stop him. We're going to the back so I can seal up that curse. Come on, don't argue, he said as Sasuke tried to yank his shoulder out of the older man's grip. I need to take care of that now before it's too late, so don't be acting selfishly. Let me just give this to Naruto, he snapped, holding up the katana, and the silver-haired Jonin conceded, having glanced up at the hooded blonde, a frown appearing on his face. Sasuke looked up and saw that Naruto was no longer standing in the same place. He was in fact, making his way over to the sandnin, practically bumping genin out of his way, seeming not to notice them. Gaara was standing there with a particularly wild look in his eyes, the large gourd on his back rattling as if there was something in there, and the sandy-haired girl was saying something close to his ear. He did not seem to hear her, and his male teammate was shrinking away as Naruto approached, clearly wanting to separate himself from whatever was about to happen. Sasuke sped up the stairs, body aching terribly, but knowing he had to stop whatever it was that Naruto was attempting to do. Kakashi-sensei made it up there first, along with Asuna Jonin. Kakashi-sensei grabbed Naruto's shoulder, pulling him to the side of his determined path, startling the blonde, who jumped, turning wild eyes up at the Jonin. He jerked his body from Kakashi-sensei, crashing into the wall, and staying there, eyes darting madly to all the other genin, no doubt believing he was being attacked. The Sunajonin was standing in front of Gaara, blocking him from view. Sasuke reached Naruto and grabbed his arm, yanking him away from Kakashi-sensei, who was attempting to talk to him, and pulled him a ways away from the others. What did I tell you about that guy? He hissed, shoving Nabeshin's katana into the blonde's shaking hands. Naruto was blinking rapidly, as if he was having a hard time seeing. Sasuke shook him roughly. Get a hold of yourself. You may be next, and you can't lose. Naruto seemed to hear him, shaking his head as if to clear away whatever was going on in there and smoothed his hood down, since it had partially fallen back, revealing some of his hair. Kakashi-sensei approached, his eye solemn and watchful, darting between the two of them. "Do you have some vendetta against the Sandnin that I don't know about, Naruto?" he asked calmly. Naruto made no reply, and Sasuke only scowled, his body aching even more now, with the extra adrenaline leaking away. The Jonin sighed. "We need to go, Sasuke." Naruto's head darted up in alarm as Sasuke released him and moved toward the stairs. Behind him he saw that the Sand Jonin was moving away from the redhead, whose face was contorted in rage, green eyes focused on the back of Naruto's head. "I'll be back," he told Naruto, whose face was a sickly yellow. "I'm just going to get this taken care of," he gestured toward his neck. "Then I'll be back. Stay with Sakura, and stop looking at that guy." Said girl was standing not too far from them, eyes clouded over with concern. "Don't lose your fight." Naruto looked down at the ground, hands gripping Nabeshin's katana to his chest as his shoulders hunched, looking like the poster child for dejection. He turned and followed Kakashi-sensei down the hall to another door, glancing back to see that Naruto was still standing there, Sakura standing near him, looking like she wanted to say something to him. "Let's make this quick," he muttered to the man, ignoring the unreadable look the Jonin sent his way. "Yes. Let's." Naruto watched Sasuke go behind what was proving to be the second worst headache he had ever felt so far, one that seemed to rocket between both ears, bouncing around inside his skull. His eyes watered from the force of it, they were noisy, a cacophony, though this time they didn't block out all sound. He could still hear, just not very well. "I should probably go see what is going on with Sasuke," a voice said near him, and he glanced up to see that it was Nabeshin, looking concerned. "That mark seems ominously familiar. Should I go?" the ghost asked, looking at him with his seemingly black eyes, rust coming from his mouth. Naruto nodded, cradling the side of his head with his left hand and moved to the rail. He could feel eyes on him, and it wasn't just them. He had foolishly attracted attention when he had gone after the redhead. He had just wanted him so bad, wanted to destroy him, couldn't wait for a match to do it. Now they were looking at him, thinking about him. He wanted to be back in his room, where it was safe. "Hey Naruto." It was Sakura, standing near him as two other genin moved to the floor, one looking more familiar than the other. "Did Sasuke tell you about the mark he has on his neck?" Naruto lifted his head and looked at the girl. She swallowed and seemed to make an effort to stare back. "Did he?" she asked again, and he shook his head carefully. She rubbed her arms as if she had a sudden chill. "It was during the fight in the Forest of Death, with that creepy guy." She glanced around quickly, clearly not wanting to be overheard as she stepped closer to him. He resisted the urge to step away, mostly because now he could hear her better since they were making such a racket in his head. "His name is Orochimaru," and he bit Sasuke on the neck, giving him that mark which he called the cursed seal. He wasn't listening to her anymore. The name Orochimaru rang some very annoying bells in his already aching head. He had never heard the name spoken before, but he had read it before, in a ninja history book, in fact. Orochimaru had been or still was, a son in one of the three, though he was exiled for some crimes experimenting on children, he believed. His blue eyes darted to where all the Jonin and the Hokage stood, and the man who he now understood was Orochimaru, was gone. His eyes fell on a ninja, the one from the first exam, the one with scars on his face, and their eyes connected. Naruto stepped back from the railing, out of sight. Sakura looked like she was about to say more, but there was an explosion down below, where a match had been taking place. Sakura turned, looking down at the match. Oh, Shino won. He didn't know or care to know who Shino was. From the corner of his eye he saw Kakashi-sensei approach, with no Sasuke. "Is Sasuke-kun alright?" Sakura asked anxiously. "Yep," Kakashi-sensei replied almost lazily. "He's resting in a hospital bed right now." Naruto turned toward the door they had gone through, hoping to find Sasuke and get away from the other Jinchuriki before he did something to attract attention again, but was stopped by a hand on his shoulder. Naruto shied away from it, putting too much weight on his wounded leg again, causing him to stumble. "You should stay here," the silver-haired Jonin said in an unusually gentle voice. Your match could be next. His dark eye drifted to Naruto's bandaged leg, and his brow furrowed in concern. Bile rose in Naruto's mouth, and he turned away, smoothing down his hood as he stared at the cracks in the wall he was leaning against, attempting to ride the headache. Winner, Kankuro. He wished he could get away from all these villagers, hated being around them. He was sure wherever Sasuke was, it was quiet, and there weren't any others around. Don't you want to see Sakura fight? Kakashi-sensei's voice was too loud, making him jump, but he didn't turn to acknowledge that he had heard the man. He wished he was away, wished he was in his room, wished he was killing the redhead. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought before he turned to seek the other out. He had to wait. He would have his chance. He would get to fight the Jinchuriki. His headache eased a little, and sounds that he couldn't hear were now more audible, the sound of kunai striking one another, female grunts. Naruto lifted his head and pushed away from the wall, moving toward the rail until he could see the fight. Sakura was fighting the noisy blonde girl. Both were beating each other bloody. Though he took a step closer, it seemed that Sakura was winning. She was certainly a better and more aggressive fighter than the blonde, better than he remembered actually, and apparently better than the blonde girl remembered too. Naruto watched as Sakura grabbed the other girl by her long ponytail and yanked her head around, punching her in the face. The blonde's head rocked back, face twisted in pain as her lip split, leg coming up and hooking around Sakura's neck. Both girls fell heavily to the ground, Sakura trying to roll out from under the blonde, but the girl squeezed her leg, trapping Sakura for a brief moment as she lifted her hands in the form of a seal. Shinten-shin no jutsu, she called, and immediately both girls went limp. Then Sakura rolled out from under the blonde's leg, standing up quickly with a grin that turned sour as she looked up at them, her eyes falling on him. Naruto stared back at the angry pale green eyes for a moment, seeing the hatred in them, then slipped away from the rail back into the gloom. He supposed Sakura had lost then. He didn't care, he just wanted to fight the redhead, then go home. Things would be good if he could do this. He headed farther down the hall just as a cramp seized his stomach, turning it into knots. He gagged, staggering against the wall, clutching his stomach with his other hand as he dry heaved through 2 more cramps. His headache was now worse than ever, his eyes dripped tears from the pressure of each heave. They were louder than ever, he couldn't hear anything but them. 2 more cramps came, then went, he could barely breathe over the heaving, and then, it was as if something broke in him, like a dam being flooded over. Chakra rushed through his body, from the very tips of his hair, which stood on end, down to the tips of his toes. The constant burning of his wounded leg stopped, he could feel the skin knit properly together. The exhaustion, bruises, and scrapes disappeared, his spine stiffening so that he was standing ramrod straight. His fingers dug into the wall that he had been kneeling against as he blinked rapidly. They had dropped down to an excited murmur, their anticipation running through him. They were making him ready to fight the red-headed Jinchuriki. He turned to see that the leaf genin were crowding near Sakura and the blonde, who were both laying against the wall up on the 2nd floor. I can't believe they knocked each other out. The chubby genin from Team 10 exclaimed as he kneeled down next to the blonde girl. They'll be fine, Kakashi-sensei was saying, though he gestured for a medic to come, pointing at the blonde girl's swollen and bloody face. The other boy, possibly named Shikamaru, Naruto wasn't completely sure, stood up and sighed. If not for Ino's Kekai Genkai, I'm pretty sure Sakura would have won this fight. She's way more tough than I remember. Why thank you, Kakashi-sensei said cheerfully, pulling out the orange book as he too stood up. The one named Shikamaru turned as if looking for someone, and seemed to spot him, looking over at Naruto. Naruto lowered his head, smoothing down his hood, but his eyes darted about, searching for the other Jinchuriki. He spotted him there, he was his Jonin-sensei still standing next to him. The redhead was staring back at him, the whites of his eyes mostly red from agitated blood vessels. He wanted to fly over there, he felt like he could fly right now, felt like a cup completely full to the rim with water. Any second it felt like chakra would come pouring out of him. He gripped Nabeshin's katana and wrung the hilt with his fingers. Mustn't go ever there, mustn't try to kill him yet. Aren't you going to make sure that your teammate is okay? Shikamaru asked, having walked over to him. Naruto tore his eyes away from the redhead to look at the boy. His hands were in his pockets, his expression looking bored, but his eyes were sharp and they studied Naruto. Naruto glanced over at Sakura, still unconscious, noticing that others were back at the rails, looking down at what seemed to be another match. A gust of wind blew through the whole area, blowing back his hood. It felt good against his flushed skin, but he pulled his hood back up to cover his hair, which was still standing on end. Another gust came along with the clatter of weapons and Shikamaru turned and moved to the railing to see the fight. Winner, Temari. Ugh, so troublesome, Shikamaru muttered, looking down at the commotion that was starting down below. A Leaf girl had lost, and apparently the green-clad boy didn't appreciate how the Suna girl had treated her. She gave her all in that battle. How could you treat her like that? The Suna girl leaned against her large fan and sneered. Shut up, loser, and get her out of here. A look of rage flew through the green boy's face. 1 second he had been holding his teammate, the next he was aiming a spinning kick at the girl, who held up her fan and blocked it. Lee, stop. A similarly clad Jonin dropped down to the first floor and approached. They looked like father and son. Suddenly the redhead spoke. Temari, you've been declared the winner. Stop wasting time and get up here. Naruto turned away and stared at a wall, purposefully giving the redhead his back. He mustn't look at him anymore. He was still so full of chakra, so ready to leap down there and fight everyone. He felt like he could clean the whole Uchiha compound twice over. He hoped he was next, he hoped it was against the redhead. He hoped. Some more words were exchanged. And then he heard Shikamaru groan. He looked at the scoreboard. Nara Shikamaru vs Kinchuchi. He shut his eyes tight as a roar of anger rushed through him, some from them, but some of his own. He needed to fight the Sunanin. He needed to fight him so that he could go home, back to his room, back to covered windows. He buried his head in his hands, nails digging into his scalp in frustration. Naruto. He didn't open his eyes or lift his head at Nabeshin's voice. I've got some bad news. I followed Sasuke, and Hatake-san put another seal over the cursed seal, one that is supposed to contain the cursed seal's power should Sasuke accidentally activate it. But, according to your sensei, it will only be as effective as Sasuke's will. If Sasuke wants the cursed seal to take over, then... Naruto opened his eyes to see Shikamaru and his opponent standing across from one another. Both took out a shuriken and tossed it at one another. He supposed that must have been why Sasuke hadn't used any jutsu when he had fought that other Leaf Nin. The cursed seal came from this guy named Orochimaru, who used to be a Leaf Shinobi, but was banished, and is now the Kage for Hidden Sound. I can't believe Kakashi was going to fight him. Nabeshin seemed to be talking to himself for a moment. Anyway, I took the liberty of following him around a bit. Damn, it's been a long time since I've seen that guy, and I've got the sense that he's planning something big, way big. I'm sure the Hokage knows about it since Mitsurushi Anko let them know that he was in the Forest of Death. Nabeshin was silent a moment. Though I couldn't care less if he's going to attack this village, I don't want that guy anywhere near Sasuke again. That cursed seal is bad news. Nothing good could possibly come from the attentions of that man Naruto. Just then a hand fell on his shoulder. Why were people touching him so much today? And he lowered his hands from his head and looked up to see that it was Kakashi-sensei again, looking concerned. He immediately noticed that everyone in the area was looking at him. Didn't you hear us calling you? You're up. Kakashi-sensei gestured toward the scoreboard, where his name and Inuzuka Kiba, a familiar name, was. His eyes darted to everyone. Shikamaru was back on the second floor looking a bit bloodier than when he had left. Ino and Sakura were conscious, both watching him but standing far from one another. Do you want to forfeit? Kakashi-sensei asked gently. Naruto shook his head, disappointment rushing through him. He had hoped he would be fighting the redhead, but it was apparently not meant to be. He would have to fight him in the finals, and in the meantime, he needed something to take the edge off, let out a little bit of chakra so he wouldn't feel like he was going to explode. Inuzuka and his dog, oh it was him, the one from Team 8, was already down there, the white puppy in his arms, looking up at him. Naruto picked up Nabeshin's katana, which he had dropped, and hopped onto the rails, dropping down to the first floor. He landed on the balls of his feet, then straightened, frowning. Why hadn't he just taken the stairs? Are you ready? The referee asked. Naruto smoothed down his hood and nodded, looking at Inuzuka from behind his bangs. The genin's face was unreadable as he stood there with the canine in his arms. All right. Begin. The referee jumped back out of the way. Naruto unsheathed Nabeshin's blade and looked over at his opponent. We'll go easy on him, Akamaru? Take him out with one punch. Shouldn't be too hard. The small puppy yipped, jumping from his arms to the ground. Naruto gazed at the dog, then at Inuzuka. He had seen him a couple times. He was always with the dog, apparently did missions with it. It was like an extension of him, like an arm or leg. If he cut it off, he imagined it would bleed profusely. The image of blood sent a rush of pleasure through him, and he shuddered, shaking his head just as Inuzuka struck. Naruto saw a fist come toward his face, and he tried to turn away, but he was too slow, and he was hit, the force of the blow knocking him several feet away. The whole right side of his face went numb. He shook his head quickly, blinking away the black spots in his vision. Just forfeit before we have to do some serious damage to the class mental case, Inuzuka suggested, not unkindly. Naruto did not reply, instead charging nimbly at the boy, dodging the dog and swinging the katana. Inuzuka slipped out of the way, Naruto only clipping a piece of the fur from around his hood and dodging another blow aimed at his head. Naruto leaped back from both boy and dog, sheathing Nabeshin's blade and making the signs for the Kagebunshin. He created 3 clones, sending them to attack the dog boy, throwing punches and kicks. He blocked several, was hit by plenty, and guffawed at the weak hits. Naruto knew that unless the clones were doing jutsu, they physically would not do much damage. He simply didn't have the muscles in his arms and legs to cause pain like Sasuke did. If he wanted a hit to count, he always had to put chakra behind it, and the clones were unwilling to expend that much, especially when their goal was merely to distract the dog boy. The dog grabbed one of the clones by the leg, growling, and the clone paused to kick the dog away, putting some chakra behind the hit so that the dog yelped loudly. Hey! Kiba snapped, punching one clone away forcefully, then jumped over to the puppy. You okay? He asked the dog as Naruto leaped above them and a clone grabbed Inuzuka's leg. The dog boy turned aggressively toward the clone, but must have seen his shadow as he brought the katana down. The dog boy rolled out of the way, twisting his ankle from the clone's grip, but not before Naruto got a piece of him. Though the katana was not his own, and felt strange to fight with, for that particular second, it felt like a mere extension of his arm. He felt the blade pass through flesh and bone, severing Inuzuka's pinky finger as he leaped out of the way, avoiding the clones, the puppy in his other arm. Naruto stared down at the bloody digit, the droplets of blood that sprinkled around it. The blood was dark against the dirty floor. If only it were the redhead's blood. His lips turned up slightly. Quadruped no jutsu. He looked up to see the dog boy crouching down like an animal on the ground, and with surprising speed he crashed into 2 of the clones, knocking them back. They staggered, frowned, then dissipated. Inuzuka turned to him with a growl, canines seeming larger and longer than before. Don't underestimate me or Akamaru. He growled. And it seemed that he was about to charge Naruto, leaning forward on both hands, then winced in pain, looking down at his right hand. His eyes went wide as he lifted the bloody, pinky-less hand up, seeming to just realize he was missing a digit. The dog barked madly at him, and Inuzuka's eyes darted to Naruto's feet, where his pinky lay next to. You're going to pay for that finger, he whispered harshly, rage passing through his face. Naruto cringed. It was easy to believe. But Naruto now understood Inuzuka's rather obvious weakness. The dog. With his left hand the dog boy produced 2 pills, soldier pills, and tossed one to the puppy and swallowed one himself. Immediately the puppy's fur turned crimson, rising on its back like an angered cat. It jumped on Inuzuka's back as he crouched there, barking as the dog boy made a seal. Then there were 2 Inuzukas, looking more feral than ever. Quadruped no jutsu. With more speed than before, both attacked, clawed hands crushing the ground where Naruto stood as the hooded blonde leaped into the air, avoiding their attacks. Chagrin rushed through him. He had been hoping to keep a good eye on the dog, but now, with the 2 leaping around him, he couldn't tell which one was the dog and which was the actual human. One clawed hand caught him in the shoulder, twisting him to the ground. Naruto smacked onto the floor and rolled as he felt them come upon him, quickly doing a cat on seal as he turned over on his back, seeing that one was directly above him. He brought his fingers to his mouth and blew a billow of fire directly into the dog boy, engulfing him in fire. The Inuzuka fell back, giving a rather human howl, and the other leaped upon him, batting away at the flames that burned away at his jacket. That was the one Naruto wanted, the one that would end this fight in his favor. Naruto jumped to his feet, snatched the fallen katana, and with a burst of chakra to his legs and feet, rushed up to the one Inuzuka who was busy rolling the other to put out the flames, the one who wasn't cursing. "Watch out!" someone called, a female voice, and the dog in the guise of a human turned at that moment, saw the blade rushing toward him, and made to leap out of the way, but was too late. Naruto felt the blade pass through bone, heard the dog-like squeal as the dog fell away from his leg, which Naruto had managed to sever. The jutsu around the dog fell away, and once again it was a small white puppy minus one leg. The leg, which fell a few feet away, popped, and was once again the leg of a small dog. Naruto moved over to the leg, and fought the urge to shudder as he picked it up with his hand, though he first covered that hand with his sweater so he didn't touch the dog's leg. Akamaru! The scream made Naruto jump, and he turned to see that the fire about Inuzuka had been put out, as well as his jutsu, leaving him with first and second degree burns, all superficial really, though he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were all for the dog bleeding profusely on the ground. He jumped to his feet and dropped down to the dog, seeming stuck between wanting to pick it up and being afraid to. Inuzuka pulled off his ruined bulky jacket, revealing a black shirt underneath as he frantically wrapped the bloody puppy up in it. "I need a medic," he called frantically, standing up, eyes darting frantically about. The referee approached, giving a little cough. "Do you forfeit this fight?" he asked. "The medic can't help unless the fight is over." Inuzuka spun, eyes falling on him, looking as if he couldn't decide. Then his eyes fell on the leg dangling from Naruto's covered hand. "Give that to me," he hissed venomously, taking a step toward him, but the referee grabbed his shoulder, stopping him. "Do you forfeit?" the referee asked again. "Make it quick, your dog doesn't have much time." The dog boy's face almost seemed to crumble as he looked down at the unconscious dog. "Yeah," he said gently. "I'm out." Then the rage returned to his face as he looked back over at Naruto. "Give me his leg," he commanded. Naruto pulled his hood up over his head, smoothing it down as he looked down at the leg in his grasp. If only it had been the red head. He looked up at the second floor where he knew the red head was. They looked at one another. He watched as his folded arms clenched tighter as he stared back down at him. What were the odds that they would fight one another in the finals? What if they didn't? What if he was made to fight someone else? Pain lanced through him as they began to stir into the frenzy. Forget the exams, he thought. They weren't important. He would have to fight him now. "I'll take that," someone was gently tugging at the leg still in his hand. Naruto looked down at the hand, then followed it up to the person who it belonged to. The woman with red eyes. He released the hand and quickly moved away from her, passing Nabeshin as he headed for the stairs. "Winner, Uzumaki Naruto." Naruto paled. They had just said his name aloud. He pace quickened, and he rushed up the stairs. Everyone would be thinking about him. He moved in the opposite direction of everyone else, turning down the hall in which he had seen Sasuke go. "Sakura is calling you," Nabeshin said behind him. Naruto paused, creating a clone and left it leaning against the wall. Ahead the hall split two ways, one left and the other right. "This way," Nabeshin directed, and he followed the ghost down a series of halls. They raged. Naruto put a hand to his chest, his heart was pounding in a funny way. "Ve must kill him." "Not now," Naruto gasped, vision blurring, heart beating in a strange way. He felt faint, the complete opposite of how he had felt 10 minutes before. "They will stop me, they will stop us." "Not yet, please not yet," he pleaded. "Who are you?" He looked up to see three Umbu standing around a door, faces covered in similar-looking masks. Naruto hunched his shoulders and blinked at them. "I think this is the part where you introduce yourself as Sasuke's teammate," Nabeshin sighed. "Tell them Kakashi sent you." Naruto hesitantly repeated this, looking at them from behind his bangs as they seemed to motionlessly scrutinize him. Then one looked at the other, they seemed to come to a silent agreement, and one held out his hand. "Give me the katana. No weapons allowed inside." Naruto handed the katana over quickly, and one opened the door. "Don't disturb the patient." one said in a rather ominous voice, and Naruto hurried inside, squinting at the brightness of the room, and blanching at the sight of the large windows to his left. Sasuke lay in a bed in the middle of the room, eyes covered by a white cloth, mouth and nose engulfed by an oxygen mask. Naruto moved to the other side of the bed and sat down on the floor next to the oxygen machine, back leaning against the bed, and buried his head in his hands, hoping to ride out the rage and anger that made his head and heart feel funny. "I'm going to watch the rest of the fights," Nabeshin said unnecessarily, and he cracked open an eye. He knew that the ghost would be going for the clone he had left behind. He wasn't stupid. He was not sure how much time had passed since his arriving there, how long he had been pleading with them to wait for the demise of the redhead, but he suddenly became aware that he and Sasuke were not alone in the room any longer. "There is such a thing as being too outstanding," a voice said conversationally. "And we both stood out too much." He lifted his head from his hands and turned, looking up into the surprised face of a rather familiar person. For a second, he could not place who he was, and as he was trying to put a name to the teenager with the glasses, noticed that there was a scalpel in his hand that was angled toward Sasuke's exposed neck. "You are just full of surprises, aren't you?" the intruder commented, mouth turning up into a smirk. Naruto's eyes drifted to the three dead Umbu in the doorway. "Stay out of my way if you want to live, kid," the gray-haired teenager said just as the scalpel disappeared from his hand. Naruto saw Kakashi-sensei standing near the fallen Umbu, the knife in his hand. The teenager did not seem to be surprised. Naruto's hands shot out on their own and grabbed Sasuke's shoulders, dragging the boy across the bed and pulling him down on top of him. Quickly rolling Sasuke off of him, he then crawled under the bed and dragged the Uchiha under there with him. The oxygen mask was yanked from his face, and to his surprise he heard a wheeze come from his chest. "Who the hell are you?" he heard Kakashi-sensei ask coldly as he reached out over Sasuke's body and pulled at the mask, trying to get the machine to move closer so that it could reach him properly. While he struggled with this, the conversation progressed. Yakushi Kabuto, that was his name. He had forfeit just as the prelims had started. He yanked harder on the cord, and finally the square oxygen machine moved on loud squeaky wheels, halting the conversation. Naruto paused, half expecting the bed to go flying, hearing quick movement, then the sound of shattering glass as he quickly placed the oxygen mask over Sasuke's nose and mouth. His lips were kind of looking blue. The room was silent again. Naruto turned his head, looking through the other side of the bed, seeing nothing different, except one of the dead Umbu had been moved, and one of the windows were broken. He watched a pair of feet turn from facing the window and walk over to the bed. The person kneeled down. "You've gotten real good with the Kage Bunshin, Naruto." Kakashi-sensei's eye was shut in a cheerful way. "I could have sworn you were out there watching the last 3 fights." Naruto said nothing, staring back at the man from under the bed. The Jonin sighed. "Well, let's get Sasuke out from under there." Naruto didn't particularly want to come out from under the bed, but he knew that Sasuke couldn't very well stay under there, and so he crawled out. Kakashi-sensei moved around the side of the bed where the oxygen machine was and pulled Sasuke from under there, placing him carefully on the bed. Naruto turned and looked at the Umbu, eyes darting around, searching for Nabeshin's katana. He stepped toward the door, stepping carefully around large splatters of blood as he peeked out the open door, spying the katana half stuck in the hallway wall. He moved over to it quickly and tried to pull it out of the wall, an unsuccessful ordeal. It was too deep. He paused as he saw several ninja approach quickly, battle in their eyes. He quickly released the hilt and lowered his head as they passed, one pausing to look at him before moving on into the room. He grabbed the hilt, putting his foot against the wall, and pulled with all his strength. The katana came free quite suddenly, and he staggered back, falling on his behind. Nabeshin came around the corner, disguised as the brown-haired boy, his mouth turned down. Naruto got to his feet. "More bad news, Naruto," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "You'll be fighting Hyuga Neji in the finals." Naruto almost choked on his own rage, but combined with theirs, it was almost debilitating. "No. He's mine. He's mine." He saw Nabeshin shy away but didn't care. He swung the blade at the wall he had just pulled it from, hacking away at it, channeling his rage into every swing. He wasn't used to being so angry, he wasn't used to such emotion. Anger belonged to them, not to him. But he wanted this to be over. He could not be plagued by this wanting for the rest of his life. He was already miserable as it was. Someone yanked the katana from his hands, and he turned on them, ready to attack, but froze when he saw it was the scarred man. The rage left him cold and hollow as he stared up into those black eyes. "You gonna be okay?" Naruto turned and fled from the hall. Nabeshin watched Naruto disappear around the corner before he looked back at the Merino Ibiki, who loomed in the hallway, looking curious as he held Nabeshin's katana. He wanted to follow Naruto, but was reluctant to leave without his blade. But how was he to get it without being asked questions? "Ibiki-san," someone called from the room, and the interrogation squad leader turned away, tossing the katana carelessly to him. Nabeshin caught the blade. Wow, that had been easy, and quickly made an exit before someone else deigned to ask who he was. He returned to where most of the genin were heading out. They all had a month to train and prepare for the finals. He paused as he saw Gaara's eyes dart around as he obviously searched for Naruto. Nabeshin grimaced. He didn't know why the Sand Jinchuriki looked so normal while Naruto looked so frightening, but he wished whatever was going on between them would stop. Naruto looked most terrifying whenever he was looking at Gaara. "Hey! You!" Nabeshin turned as Sakura approached him, her face determined. "Who are you?" she demanded to know. Nabeshin smiled. "I'm Naruto's cousin, Uzumaki Nabeshin. How's it going?" The girl looked completely at a loss. "Naruto has a cousin." "Yeah, I know, right? He's so antisocial. Anyway, I'm in town and figured I'd help him out since he's got issues." He gave her a charming smile. A funny look came over her. "You said your name is Nabeshin? Were you helping us in the Forest of Death?" Nabeshin shook his head. "Nope, can't possibly know what you're talking about." "Well, I gotta go. See you later." He waved and quickly rushed off before she could ask any more questions, chuckling to himself. Uzumaki Nabeshin. What a laugh. Chapter 17. Sasuke slept with his mouth closed and liked to sleep on his sides. This was something that Naruto had observed over the years, which meant that he didn't snore. In fact, the only time Sasuke did snore was when he had a cold and had to sleep on his back. And of course, he was usually too miserable to get proper sleep, so even that was short-lived and didn't happen very often. The thing was, even though the Uchiha didn't snore, he still made noise when he slept, noise that Naruto had gotten used to, noise that was eerily absent in the room. It had been a long time since the hooded blonde had been alone, long enough that the absence of Sasuke's breathing was making him nervous. Though they were a hot murmur in his head, the silence of the room seemed oppressive, and as he sat in his corner rocking, he could not take his eyes off of the Uchiha's empty bed. "Gaara, Gaara, Gaara," they howled, and Naruto cradled his head in misery against the constant obsession with the other Jinchuriki. If only he had killed him earlier, then they would not make him suffer over it. Naruto shot to his feet and left the room, heading down the stairs and into the kitchen, grabbing his cleaning supplies from under the sink and began to make quick work of the house, not bothering to use clones this time. He wanted to do everything himself. 3 hours later, and the house was satisfactory, but his head still hurt, and they were still speaking of the red head. Grabbing a broom, he stepped out onto the porch to sweep away the dust and leaves that had collected there while he and Sasuke had been away. Nabeshin was sitting on the steps, back to him, the disgusting stench of cigarettes hitting the hooded blonde's nose immediately. The ghost was hunged as himself, but without the pieces of his brain exposed, looking quite alive. With each exhale, the smoke came out black instead of white, and to Naruto, it smelled like decay. He seemed to be staring at the nearest Uchiha, the woman with the baby, who was still crying, cradling the silent child in her bloody arms. Naruto lowered his hood and began to sweep the dust from the porch, startling the smoking ghost, who turned his head to look back at him. "Sasuke shouldn't be out for too long," the ghost said, standing up and stretching. Naruto continued to sweep as the ghost seemed to scrutinize him. "He'll be fighting the Jinchuriki Gaara in the finals." Rage flew through him, and there was a cracking sound, the bottom half of the broom falling to the wooden porch, while the other piece stayed in his bony hands. Naruto slowly released the handle, letting it clatter to the wooden floor, to look at his shaking palms, filled with splinters. "I've been following some of Orochimaru's subordinates around," Nabeshin continued, sounding very ill at ease, and it seems that he has planned an invasion with the Sunanins. I have to go look more deeply into this, but I just wanted to let you know that it's supposed to be triggered during the final fight between Gaara of the Sand and Sasuke. Naruto looked up at him from behind his hair. The man gave him an uneasy smile. What I'm saying is, in all the chaos, no one is going to stop you from fighting him. They quieted. This was true. In war, no one would stop him from attacking an enemy. Relief flooded through him, such relief that he felt muscles loosen in his shoulders. He would have his chance. Perhaps another ninja would go tell someone of an impending attack, but Naruto would not. He was not going to let anything interfere with this chance, a chance for relief against their fury and obsession. He would have his chance. The only time Kakashi bothered to go anywhere near the Yamanaka's flower shop was when he was visiting a grave, so he tended to associated the floral death trap as a rather morbid place, and though he wasn't there for some grave flowers, he was just as unhappy as if he were. So it was to his minor relief when his eye fell on the very person he had been looking for as he reluctantly stepped into an allergenic's nightmare. Inoichi, he greeted softly as he approached the counter. The blond man was leaning over a sheet of paper. From his quick glance he could see the calculated numbers of inventory in neat lines. The interrogations squad member lifted sharp blue eyes from the paper and gave him a careful smile. Kakashi, he gave him a nod. Here for the usual? No thank you. Actually, I'm here for you. His words got the response he expected, a snort of amusement. Not for sale, the man said, chuckling as he put the paper away and turned to him fully. But what can I do for you? I was hoping to borrow you for the day, while I still have the chance, to check out the mental state of one of my students. Inoichi nodded knowingly. The Uchiha kid? Isn't he still in the hospital? No and yes, he leaned against the counter, glancing at a patron who was in the process of shoving a rose up her nostrils. My other student, Uzumaki Naruto, is in need of a full evaluation. He watched the puzzled frown pass over the Yamanaka's face. Uzumaki, that name sounds vaguely familiar. I profess that I'm not particularly familiar with Team 7 aside from that Harano girl my daughter keeps raving about and dash. I heard that, a flat voice interrupted as the Yamanaka girl entered from the back room, a large vase tucked under one arm. Her face was set in a scowl, one that intensified as her pale blue eyes fell on him. Maybe you should bring in your whole team while you're at it, she snapped as she passed by them and went further into the floral jungle beyond. It had been 2 days since the prelims, and he was sure that the extremely talkative girl had worn her father's ears down with her harping. Inoichi sighed and rolled his eyes, moving from behind the counter and heading for the door. A full evaluation, you say? Why don't you take him to the ward down at the hospital? I know some great psychiatrists there that I can refer you to. My cousin, Koji is excellent for genin with PTSD. Kakashi shook his head, stuffing both hands in his pockets. He won't be willing. You can think of him as an enemy ninja completely unwilling to give up any information. A gleam appeared in the blond man's eyes and he cracked his knuckles in clear anticipation. This sounds interesting, he cut him off as he opened his mouth. Don't tell me what is wrong with him, it'll ruin the chase. Kakashi gave a small grunt of unhappiness. He had put this off as long as he could, but no longer would he turn a blind eye to Naruto's unstable behavior. No caring sensei would. But what would he do with Inoichi's diagnosis? What if Naruto's instability was as debilitating as he imagined? Would he have him removed? He grimaced. What hell would the Uchiha put him through if he tried? And then there was replacing him with another. Replacing Kairi had been enough for him. Kakashi opened the gates when they arrived at the entrance of the compound, allowing the Yamanaka to step through before he closed the gate behind him. The fact of the matter was that he believed that something wasn't quite right with the seal that held the Kyuubi. He was sure that this contributed to Naruto's mental instability, and if so, could it be fixed? When was the last time the Hokage had looked at it? He himself had inspected it that day in Wave, when Naruto had been lying before him, emaciated and full of pins. He had looked it over, but he was no seal master, he couldn't be sure. Inoichi's voice shook him from his dark thoughts, and he looked around, realizing he had gone off the correct path and led them down a winding path between houses. He turned them in a direction he knew the main house was. This is the first time I've been in here, Kakashi raised a brow. You know how the Uchihas were, they would have kept the Hokage out if they could have gotten away with it. As they came up the side of a house, Kakashi froze upon hearing a male voice coming from around the bend, one that clearly didn't belong to Naruto. His hand shot up, making Yamanaka stop. They carefully moved to the side of the house and peered around the corner. At a bit of a distance was the main house. Naruto was standing on the porch before a tall man wearing standard ninja attire, sporting short black hair and pale skin. Something about him was eerily familiar. He lifted a cigarette to his mouth and inhaled, the end of the stick lighting up, then he exhaled, and black smoke came from his lips and nose. There was an intake of breath at his side, and he turned to see Inoichi's pale face, eyes wide but staring intently at the unknown man. "Impossible," he breathed. "I know that man." Kakashi looked back at the man who was achingly familiar. Naruto's pale blue eyes followed the cigarette to the man's lips, a look of disgust passing through his unhappy face, and it seemed that the man halted in taking another swig, a look of nervousness coming upon his face. He dropped the cigarette and stepped on it, grounding it into the dirt. "Who is he?" Inoichi was looking very pale. "Nabeshin, Uchiha Nabeshin, I swear that's him." An Uchiha, yes, he had the familiar features of the almost dead clan. Kakashi stealthily moved behind the house, gaining closer ground so he could hear what this supposed dead man was saying to his student. Both Jonin moved up the side of the main house, staying behind the high bushes that ran along the side of the main house. "Talk it over with Sasuke before you do anything though. I don't think you have the strength to kill him by yourself. I give it a day or two before he is conscious." Seeing him closer, and from the front, yes, he was clearly an Uchiha, even if a strange haze of reddish-brown smoke was coming from his mouth with every word, as if his lungs were still full of smoke. "It's him," Inoichi whispered, voice empty. The Uchiha opened his mouth as if to speak, but both his and Naruto's hooded head jerked to the left, as if hearing something, then the supposedly dead Uchiha turned and looked directly at the bushes where they were hidden. His hand flew to the katana at his side, and Kakashi leaped from the bushes, intent on getting the man away from his student. The Uchiha leaped back, katana unsheathed, and as Kakashi drew his kunai, the man turned the blade on himself and impaled himself through the chest completely, pale face twisted in rage. The Jonin reached out to grab his arm as he fell back, but was pushed back by a wave of chakra and smoke as the man popped away, his katana clattering on the ground. He turned to Naruto, moving toward his student in case another bunshin came out, and saw as his student staggered back, eyes flashing red and giving a quick series of nasty coughs before turning and rushing toward the doors of the main house. Inoichi stopped the kid, grabbing an arm and yanking the small kid back, inwardly wincing when the kid's body collided into his own. He hadn't expected him to be such a lightweight, but his fingers, which were gripping the boy around the bicep, were touching. The kid had that little muscle. He expected the kid to gain his bearings so he could look the small guy over and make sure he wasn't harmed by Nabeshin. Just thinking the name sent a chill down his spine, but the kid did the complete opposite. Instead, the kid attempted to jab him in the gut with his elbow as Hatake made the signs for a bunshin, no doubt to search the area for the Uchiha. Inoichi twisted the boy around so that a bony arm was up behind his back. "Relax, kid, we're not going to hurt you. We're dash." The kid didn't seem to be listening. Instead, he was trying to break free from his grip, pulling dangerously on the arm. He could feel the thin bones creaking ominously. "Naruto," Kakashi called calmly, just as a whine of desperation passed the boy's seemingly bloodless, cracked lips. Hatake wasn't kidding about the instability of this kid. He didn't seem to care that his own sensei was trying to calm him down. Inoichi passed the boy to his sensei, a frown on his face as he watched the ninja try to bring reason to the almost hysterical child. Uzumaki Naruto, the name was hanging around the edges of his mind. Did he know someone with that last name? Giving up, the man wrapped two arms around the child, holding him with his back against his chest, facing Inoichi. "Now's as good a time as any," Kakashi grumbled. Though his face was mostly hidden, it was easy to see how upset he was by his student's terror. And the kid did look terrified. He was practically hyperventilating, pale blue eyes bloodshot and wild. Inoichi stepped forward and dropped a hand on the top of Naruto's head, noticing the kid's hair for the first time. It was thin and brittle, not dirty, for the kid smelled like cleanser, but it lacked the luster of healthy hair, wispy and chopped at odd lengths. He activated the mind-reading jutsu, sucking in a breath as it felt like he was being propelled forward. It was the most uncomfortable part of the technique, the feeling of being thrust forward uncontrollably when he knew that he was really standing before Kakashi and his upset student. Beyond that though, when his feet landed himself in someone's mind, that was the part that he loved. Every person's mindscape was different, usually matching the personality of the person it belonged to. Over the many interrogations that Inoichi had participated in, he had found that the mindscapes that least mirrored the person's personality were the ones that were dangerous. On the many occasions that they had captured spies, they of course found completely different personalities hidden beneath the surface of their cover. One he particularly remembered was a Kunoichi from Iwa, who had married a Konohan merchant in an attempt to acquire secrets from Hidden Leaf. She'd had 3 children by the time her cover was blown, and had been called by her neighbors as a kind and caring person. Her mind had been the most beautiful one he had ever seen, mirroring a coral reef in tropical waters. Just the memories of the colors alone was enough to give him a fond pause. Whenever he had gotten close to breaking past her defenses, the reef would become more beautiful and distracting, the sea flowers more brilliant, the fish more flashy. As it turned out, the kind caring woman had been exiled from Iwa for preying on many of the men and boys there. She had been too powerful to kill, so they had sent her to Konoha on a long-term mission, where she had secretly been preying on the unknowing men here. Uzumaki's mindscape was not beautiful in any stretch of the imagination. Inoichi looked up at the dark gray jagged ceiling, resisting the urge to crouch. He was in a small hot cave, an incredibly humid one, with his scalp close to scraping the rocky ceiling. He was closed in on all sides except before him, where 3 black holes remained, all about the same size, too small. He frowned. Inside the mind of children did not normally look like this. The mind of a child was much more chaotic, disorderly, much less organized. The mind always mirrored the child's present state of mind, whether they were happy or sad, angry or pensive. A cave was not something he expected. Uzumaki Naruto, definitely not a happy child. And again, the name was strangely familiar. He was sure he had heard it somewhere. It was at the edge of his mind. Inoichi stepped up to the hole directly in front of him and peered into the pitch-black darkness that seemed to emanate from it. He could see nothing beyond a foot. He moved to the one on the right, then the left, gazing in with the same results. Interesting. He would have to ask later if Kakashi had been teaching genjutsu to his students already. This boy's mind was making traps. Taking the hole on the left, Inoichi climbed in, his shoulders grazing the sides, testing for claustrophobia, clearly. There was no telling where the hole would lead, perhaps a dead end, perhaps the entrance would close behind him and he would have to cancel the jutsu and start over. But he was confident that he would be able to crack through this child's defenses. He had worked on much more dangerous people, and this boy would not be a challenge. He was a favor for a fellow jonin. It was the smell that hit him first, a rank, sour smell, the kind similar to that of a battlefield, after the initial slaughter had taken place. Inoichi stopped, squinting into the darkness as he attempted to crawl forward on his elbows, face twisted in a grimace as the smell got stronger. He'd obviously chosen the right hole. A sound came from the darkness beyond him, a scuffling sound of something coming. Inoichi stopped moving and waited, gazing into the darkness, and though the stench increased, he was too curious to cancel the jutsu. He was breathing out of his mouth by the time whatever it was reached him. At first, he could only make out dingy blonde hair, then, a naked child slithered face down toward him, the rancid smell seeming to hit its peak, making his stomach roll. An inner manifestation of the Uzumaki kid? Less than 4 feet from him, the kid lifted his head, and Inoichi could only stare as the twisted face greeted him, a face not belonging to the boy. The mouth was split from ear to ear, revealing sharp yellow teeth. The eyes were too large for the face, leaking blood as they seemed about to pop from its head. A misshapen hand, half claw half fingers, reached out for him, and the Yamanaka slapped it away, clearly out of reflex alone. The boy/creature spoke as it withdrew the appendage. "This is not your place, intruder. It belongs to us. Do you want to stay?" The voice came out breathy, almost weak. "I am not here to cause you any harm," he said to the boy's mental defense. "I am here to help you." And he was, for this said little boy with the disturbingly familiar name was a ninja of Hidden Leaf, and he would not turn aside knowing one needed his help. Something flashed through the misshapen face, an almost incredulous look before a hissing laugh escaped the wide mouth, and the bizarre arm shot forward again and grabbed him by the wrist. Inoichi did not stop at this time. "You do not recognize us," the boy/creature said as it began moving back down the hole, pulling Inoichi along with it. "You are not knowing us by face and name, but we will have with you a reunion like none other." He did not fight. He needed to be pulled deeper into the boy's psyche to be able to gauge how damaged mentally the boy was. Even if the unease he felt was continuing to grow. "And like the days of a tree, so shall your pain be, and we shall sup upon it." Suddenly the tunnel gave way beneath them, completely startling the seasoned ninja, and he tried to grab something, allege anything, but there was only the inky darkness and the boy/creature. They both descended down into nothingness. And still he did not cancel the jutsu. Ground came suddenly and unforgiving, making Inoichi's legs crumble beneath him with a pained grunt. He quickly stumbled to his feet, racing to gather his bearings as he spied the boy/creature crouching in front of him, large red eyes focused on the gray ground. A whimper came from behind him, and he turned to spy another child, this one looking exactly like Uzumaki, drawn up in a ball, red-rimmed blue eyes focused beyond them. Inoichi turned to see what the object of the boy's terror was, and came to notice the large multitude of eyes watching him from the darkness, hundreds of them, all different shapes, sizes, colors, all focused on him. He felt naked, exposed. He felt an alien awareness about those many eyes. "Nikke, Nikke, Nikke," the boy/creature whined, and the hairs raised on the back of the Jounin's neck as he turned his attention back to it. "What did you call me?" he whispered harshly as the wide mouth began to shrink, returning to a normal size, but pouty, like a woman's. The bloody eyes turned a stormy gray, the grimy dull blonde hair turning rich and flowing. The boy/creature was no longer. It was now a woman he hadn't seen for 12 years actually. Yamanaka Eiga, his older sister, who had died in battle fighting the Kyuubi. "Impossible." She crawled toward him, naked, her face twisted in pain. "Nikke, my sunflower. Why haven't you saved me?" It was too impossible. How could this boy have known Eiga to bring up a manifestation of her? He'd have been a mere baby or not even born yet. She reached out to him with familiar calloused hands. "It hurts so much here, Nikke," she sobbed. "Every second feels like an eternity." Tears streamed down her face, her beautiful gray eyes begging him. Inoichi took a pained step back, his hands coming up to cancel the jutsu, but his wide eyes could not look away from her. "Please don't leave," she gasped, her eyes falling on his hands. "Please don't leave me with him. I did my duty to Konoha, for the clan. Please save me, Inoichi." Inoichi's mouth opened. From what? He wanted to say to his sister no to the manifestation, that is, until a giant, red, nine-tailed fox appeared behind her. He cried out in shock as a clawed paw dropped down on his sister and pulled her closer to it while she screamed her brother's name. The demonic eyes of the Kyuubi bored into his own as it spoke. "They are all mine." And as it said this, other voices joined Eiga. He saw fellow ninja, Alkia, appear from beneath the many tails. Yamanaka. Narahakiyama, still 13 years old, waved to him desperately, attempting to reach him with a face lined with pain, but was shoved aside by Jin, a man he had shared a few sakes with on many occasions. "Inoichi." His face too was lined with such agony. "Help me. Save me. Yamanaka-san." A Hyuga crawled over from behind one of the many tails. "Help dash. Please dash. It hurts so much." Eiga's voice rose above them all, though it was barely a whisper. "Being here hurts so much." A bellowing cackle of laughter filled his ears and he gazed up numbly at the Kyuubi. Now he knew why the name Uzumaki was so familiar to him. The Jinchuriki. "They re all mine," the fox crowed. Eiga gave a screech, and Inoichi saw that the fox's paw was crushing her. "Eiga!" he cried, leaping forward as her eyes were pushed from her head. He howled in horror just as a pain blossomed through him, and light flooded the dark hell. He should have known something was wrong the moment Inoichi's hand began to tremble where it was buried in the limp boy's hair. Then there was the sweat and overall pallor of his face, but Kakashi had figured he was a seasoned ninja. He knew how to handle himself. And even though it was taking longer than he expected, and Naruto's very light body was starting to feel a bit heavy, he endured. It was stressful, being on alert and not being able to move. Though the compound was as silent as a grave, he half expected more not dead Uchihas to show up. His clone had done a quick search of the compound, but had come up with nothing. The katana was the only thing left behind. A strange sound was coming from Naruto's mouth, a creepy sound, that at first he did not recognize, until it manifested itself as laughter. Naruto was laughing. He'd only seen the boy smile once, a small feeble thing that it was, so for actual laughter to be coming from the kid sent chills up and down his spine. And then Inoichi gave a chilling howl. Kakashi jerked his student away from Inoichi's hand, and the man staggered back, tripping on the landing steps behind him and falling on his backside. Naruto writhed in his arms, his laughter becoming more erratic as he struggled against the shinobi's arms. "Inoichi!" Kakashi called, staring at the pale man sitting on the steps, eyes wide and frozen on nothing. This had been a mistake. He should have let sleeping dogs lie. Blunt teeth sank into his right forearm, startling the Jonin into releasing his student. Naruto staggered forward before running up the steps and into the main house, chaotic laughter following him in. Kakashi moved over to the pale Jonin and kneeled before him so that they were face to face. The blonde looked like he had come from the horrors of battle. "Inoichi!" He snapped his fingers to gain the man's attention, and it seemed to partially work, for the man seemed to focus on him. But the expression did not fade. "He has them," he whispered. "He has them all?" "What?" Kakashi snapped his fingers again as Inoichi seemed to lose focus again. "Who has who?" He seemed to focus then, eyes sharpening. His hands reached out and gripped Kakashi's shoulders with alarming strength. "Kyubi. You remember Hakiyama? Aga, my sister. All the others who were devoured by the fox. The Kyubi has them inside there with him." Kakashi stood up abruptly, backing away from the other Jonin, heart pounding. All this time he has been torturing them. Wait, Inoichi," Kakashi cut in as the blonde got to his feet, color returning to his flesh, righteous fury beginning to rise. "This could simply be a trick. She called me by my childhood pet name. No one outside my family knew it, and that boy surely couldn't have. He was but a mere babe when she was killed. The fox has them, Kakashi. Our friends, my sister, and I bet my life on this being the reason behind your student's mental problems." Inoichi gave a sudden wild laugh. "Uzumaki Naruto, the Jinchuriki boy. Why hadn't I remembered?" The laughter faded and angry eyes turned his way. "Why didn't you warn me of who he was?" Truthfully, it disturbed him that everyone had seemed to have forgotten Naruto. At least they should have recognized his last name. Kakashi shook his head. "If what you say is to be believed, then we need to notify the Hokage of the situation immediately and bring Naruto to him." He looked over the Jounin's shoulder at the house where his tormented student had fled. Man, he wasn't looking forward to retrieving him. Yamanaka seemed to have completely gathered his bearings, judging by the set of his shoulders and the rather determined look on his face as his eyes darted about the eerily silent compound. "But where does the Uchiha fit into this?" he muttered before disappearing in a swirl of leaves. Kakashi carefully walked up the steps and into the main house, senses alert as the strong scent of cleanser hit him. The place was as silent as the grave and almost as dark. He headed in the direction he knew Sasuke's room was, heading up the stairs and halting at the top. Down the hall, in front of the bedroom door, lay Naruto, face down. He quickly moved to his student's side and turned him over, grimacing at the bloody face that greeted him. He sighed and brushed some hair from his face before carefully picking him up and heading for the front door. Nabeshin followed the Jonin out of the house but stopped on the steps, watching along with the other Uchiha as the man made his way out of the compound with Naruto in his arms. He turned to the woman with the baby Yura, if he remembered correctly. "I appreciate the warning earlier, but it would have been nice if you had told us sooner." He ended with a shout, and the dead baby began to cry. Yura flinched and moved away. Nabeshin would have punched something if it would do any damage, but instead gave a deep sigh, hanging his head back and staring up at the clear sky. Inoichi, they had been friends in their younger days, off and on. He hadn't wanted the man to see him again. This could interfere with his plans. With another sigh he followed after Hatake, needing to know where he was taking the boy. It was to no surprise that they arrived at the hospital, and the Hokage was waiting for them, along with, to his surprise, Jiraiya, the Toad Sunin. Inoichi was also there, looking fidgety. "I have a room prepared for him," the wizened man said, turning down the hall. Before Hatake could follow, 3 medics came up to him with a stretcher, and he carefully laid his limp student down on it. As they moved after the Hokage, one took out a pair of scissors and quickly began to cut away Naruto's bloody sweater, then quickly wiped his bloody face. All this was done before they even reached the room the Hokage had set up. They carefully transferred him over to the bed, and Nabeshin could see the blonde more clearly without the hooded sweater that was always drowning him. He grimaced. The boy was as emaciated as he remembered, this skin peppered with bruises. The medics paused briefly, no doubt not expecting this, before they quickly moved into action, grabbing a saline drip and IV, quickly hooking up a vein. "What happened?" This from Jiraiya, and Nabeshin saw the shock in his eyes as he stared at the boy. The Hokage sighed. "Naruto hasn't been, well." "What do you mean? Hasn't he been getting any financial aid?" The Sunin was starting to look angry. "Who's been watching him? What orphanage has he been at?" A medic came in with a series of medical devices, and began to prepare Naruto for an NG tube. "Naruto hasn't been in an orphanage since he was 4. Jiraiya's face darkened like a thundercloud, making the medics nervous as one tipped Naruto's head back and the other began to carefully insert the tube up one nostril. "Then who's been taking care of him?" They finished tubing the kid up and taped the tube to his nose. Nabeshin could only imagine how Naruto would respond to this one once he awakened, and it seemed the Hokage was thinking along the same line. "Would it be safe to sedate him?" the old man asked one of the medics. "He's not the type to come to, happily." The medic looked at him, then down at the boy. "Perhaps a very mild one," he conceded, looking at the second medic, who nodded and quickly left the room. "It's probably for his own good. His body not only shows signs of malnutrition, but also sleep deprivation. He could use the rest." The medic then left, passing the returning medic who injected drugs into Naruto's saline drip. "Should keep him out for a few hours," the medic mumbled, bowing to the Hokage. "Call us if there is something you need." Silence returned as the medic left. The Toad Sunin was pinching the bridge of his nose, obviously in irritation. "So tell me why no one was watching Minato's son." Nabeshin watched as all ninja in the room cringed, including Inoichi, who was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest. "Naruto does not want to be around anyone, let alone allow someone to take care of him." The Hokage replied, eyes going distant for a moment. "There is Sasuke," Kakashi murmured gently, his troubled eye on the tube that was feeding nutrients into his student. "Who is Sasuke?" Jiraiya inquired, pulling out a chair and dragging it to Naruto's bedside. He pulled down the thin sheet that covered the genin's body, grimacing at the sight of how thin it was. He leaned forward and touched the seal around the navel of Naruto's slightly concave stomach with some chakra. Nabeshin came closer to see the seal himself. It was an 8-trigram seal, a particularly good one, though it gave him the chills to see it. The seal allows for some of the Kyuubi's chakra to bleed into Naruto's pathways. The Toad Sunin pointed to the upper and lower seals, while keeping the fox contained. He shook his white head. "It's as stable as it could be." "I don't understand." Inoichi moved from the wall, agitation humming about him. Nabeshin moved from the bed and stood in front of Inoichi, peering into his eyes. The man was still shaken, it seemed, his pupils slightly enlarged, barely holding himself together. "If the seal is working properly, then why is the fox still in contact with the boy?" He wiped a line of sweat running down his temple. "And what of Eiga and the others?" Jiraiya sent him a puzzled look. "Eiga? Eiga was my sister. She was eaten by the Kyuubi that day. But when I went into Uzumaki's mind, she was there. They all were." The Hokage whipped his head around and stared incredulously at the Jonin as Nabeshin moved away, turning to stare at the unconscious boy. "They devour souls," Fugaku's words came back to him. Nabeshin's expression soured as he crouched in a corner farthest from them, near Black Eyes watching. "Are you sure of this?" Sandaime demanded. Inoichi nodded. The demon has them captive along with himself. The old man turned horrified eyes onto the boy. I cannot begin to imagine the mental torture this boy goes through hourly, though I have been privy to much of its effects over the years. He cannot participate in the semi-finals like this, Hatake stated, looking at the Hokage, and Nabeshin's face twisted. I'm surprised he even made it this far. The Hokage nodded. I will have to withdraw him from the exam. A hasty decision, Nabeshin thought with a groan. Naruto was not going to appreciate this, though he imagined the boy was not going to appreciate a lot of things once the drugs wore off, like being in a hospital. That was bound to test the blonde's sanity in so many ways that Nabeshin didn't want to be around to witness, especially if it was taken out on him like it was on that broomstick. Of course, there was also the revelation that within his body lay the tormented souls of fellow ninja, even more, the thought that perhaps several Uchiha may also be there. His mind ran over those who went missing during the fight against the fox. Akio, Daiki, Goro, those were a few that he could remember searching for in the aftermath. Were they in there? Now who is Sasuke again? Jiraiya asked. Uchiha Sasuke. The one who survived the massacre. Jiraiya turned flat, cold eyes on them. You left him with Orochimaru's latest target. The Hokage shrugged. He's been with Naruto for 6 years, long before Orochimaru set his sights on him. Sasuke is the only one he trusts. I'm afraid I was lucky enough to get through the door. He looked at Jiraiya. Perhaps there is a way to modify the seal dash. He glanced over at Inoichi. Maybe a way to free our shinobi. Jiraiya stared pensively at the boy. I wouldn't dare tamper with it until further investigation. Why is he so thin? If he's been living with the Uchiha, there should be enough for both of them to eat well. The Hokage just sighed some more and pulled out his pipe. That is a discussion for another night. In the meantime, tell me about this Nabeshin character that is supposed to be dead. An old friend of mine, Inoichi said grimly, or as much of a friend an Uchiha could be to someone outside of the clan. He was also part of the Konoha military police, if I remember correctly. Oh yes, and he had been given hell for it on too many occasions. He was killed by Itachi, I'm positive of it, because I saw his body just before it was cremated. But then, there he was, talking with Uzumaki, same as the day before he died. Did he say anything? Jiraiya asked. Inoichi looked over at Kakashi. He was talking about waiting for Sasuke to wake up before Naruto tried to kill someone who, I'm not sure. Kakashi's eye moved back to Naruto. He was a clone, that much we know for sure. The question is it really the Uchiha, or a clone hung to look like him? And why? Why him? Why not henge another Uchiha? Is the Uchiha kid awake yet? Jiraiya asked. Kakashi shook his head. Then we'll have to wait until either one of these boys wake up to find out more. Don't wait for Naruto, Kakashi replied flatly. He doesn't talk to anyone other than Sasuke. We'll have to wait for the Uchiha to wake up to ask any questions. Nabeshin got to his feet and passed through the wall, making his way out of the hospital and out into the village. Things were getting more complicated. He returned to consciousness slowly, almost reluctantly, because he was warm, and the bed was soft and cozy, and he didn't particularly care to leave it. He turned over onto his side, nestled in, but squinted. There was too much light inside of the room, it shone through his eyelids, making it hard to return to that comfortable darkness. He wasn't used to their room being so bright. Had Naruto removed the newspaper from the windows? Or were they open? Relax, Sasuke slurred, grabbing the warm blanket engulfing him and pushing it off, exposing his skin to the cold air. He groaned, but knew he had to start moving before his blonde roommate had an aneurysm. I'll fix the windows. He slipped off the bed, feet getting caught in the sheets, making him stagger forward. His eyes shot open and he grabbed onto the stand next to the bed, blinking rapidly into the increasingly unfamiliar room. The room was far from his own, being that it was a hospital room, empty but for a bed, and stand with a pitcher of water, and an IV stand next to it. The window was bright and wide open, with a perfect view of the Hokage's monument within its sight. He rubbed the grit from his eyes and staggered over to the window, pulling the curtains closed so that gloom entered the room. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to gather his wits about him. How had he ended up in the hospital again? Ceiling. Kakashi-sensei was supposed to have put a seal over the one Orochimaru had given him. Sasuke got up and moved to the mirror, turning his head to the side to see his neck, touching the spot where the seal was with a bit of chakra. The seal showed up, but with a circling seal around it. Was the Jonin successful? Fujiharan, Kakashi said, making the genin jump, and he turned to glare at the man in the doorway. That's the name of the seal I put on top of the heaven seal. Hopefully it will work. Sasuke rubbed his neck, which felt a bit sore actually, he felt sore all over. How long have I been out? Kakashi-sensei shrugged. A few days. A few days. What kind of trouble could Naruto get into in a few days? Sasuke's eyes darted about, searching for some clothes. No doubt, Naruto hadn't eaten anything in the last few days, and hadn't been training for the next round. Wait, had Naruto even won his round at the prelims? He looked at his sensei. What about the exam? Did Naruto already have his fight? Who was he up against? As he shot questions at the man, he searched the room for clothing, finding his shirt and shorts in a cabinet cleaned and stitched. He shrugged out of the hospital clothing and pulled on his own as Kakashi-sensei spoke. Naruto fought against Inuzuka Kiba, yes he won, and the semi-finals are less than a month from now, which means we have less time to train. Where are you going? Sasuke was attempting to move past the man. I have to go back to the compound and make sure Naruto is okay. He leveled a glare on the man when he still didn't move from the doorway. Naruto's not there, Kakashi-sensei replied calmly, his eye watching him closely. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Where is he? Sasuke demanded, feeling nervous of a sudden. Naruto didn't particularly like to go outside if he could help it. 2 floors down, room 101, Kakashi was still watching him intently as Sasuke's mind began to speed through possibilities. The fight between Naruto and Dog Boy must have been pretty bad if it had the hooded blonde laid up in the hospital. Naruto, in a hospital, Sasuke took a step forward again, and this time Kakashi-sensei moved out of his way. He traveled down the hall and took a lift 2 floors down, the Jonin standing silently behind him. When he arrived at Naruto's room, his eyes immediately moved to the corners, expecting to see Naruto huddled in one of them, but no, he was in the bed. What the hell? The Uchiha blanched at the sight of his roommate, rushing over to the bed and halting, managing to keep his mouth from dropping open as he stared at the tube-filled blonde. There were needles going into his veins at the crook of his arms, a tube taped to his nose. He was completely exposed, no hooded sweater to hide his face and arms. His hair had been brushed back from his face, his skin had some color. What happened? He demanded. He was going to kill Inuzuka the next time he saw him. His eyes fell on the strap across the blonde's torso, ankles, and wrists. Why is he tied up? Naruto definitely isn't a morning person, or a person who wakes up well at all. Sasuke sent him a flat look. He keeps trying to escape every time he regains consciousness. Pulled out the tubes twice already, so they've decided to keep him mildly sedated and strapped. He's officially been labeled a problem patient by some of the nurses. That sounded just like Naruto. Sasuke sighed and pulled the chair nearby toward the bed and sat down, glancing over at the wide-open windows. He'd have to get some newspaper for those. What happened with his fight with Inuzuka? Kakashi moved to the other side of the bed. The fight was short. Naruto won and he wasn't badly injured. Can't say the same for Inuzuka's dog, Akamaru. Naruto cut off one of its legs. Sasuke held back the proud smirk that was trying to grow across his pale face. It was a clean cut though, so they've managed to reattach it. Some physical therapy should bring the dog back to 100% fighting ability. Sasuke looked up at the Jonin with a frown. Then why is he here? To this, Kakashi-sensei said nothing, instead pulling his orange book out and flipping it open. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Why didn't the Jonin answer? Did he have something to do with why Naruto was in here? An alarming thought flashed through his suspicious mind. Had they taken Naruto from the compound? Did they? Naruto isn't going to participate in the semi-finals, the man said instead. Sasuke grit his teeth, feeling hot anger run through him. Why not? Really, Sasuke? Kakashi sent him an irritated look. Look at him. They weighed him at 86 pounds. 86. If not for the Kyuubi's chakra that bleeds through that seal, he would have had major organ failure by now, which would leave him very dead. A regular person would have died by now. Sasuke. Anger left him drained and cold, and he peered at the blonde's taped face. He squinted. Naruto's complexion did look a bit rosy, and the bags under his eyes were gone. He looked better than Sasuke had ever seen him, and he had to concede though Naruto may not like it, he could use the bed rest. Who is Nabeshin? The question came out of nowhere. He could not control the stiffening of his shoulders. He looked up at the Jonin, who was staring at him intently. Why was he asking? Had he met Nabeshin? Did he have anything to do with why Naruto was here? Questions ran through his mind wildly. And how could he explain about Naruto's ability to speak with the dead? About his clones housing one of his dead brethren? How to speak of such a sensitive subject, something that was none of the Jounin's business? It was their business, his and Naruto's. No one else. So he did the first thing that came to mind. One of my cousins. He's dead now, he replied in a clipped tone. Why? Kakashi said nothing, instead putting the book away. Let's go. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Where? To train, or course. I can teach you to use that Sharingan better. You have to fight Gaara, you know. Sasuke's brows rose in surprise. He could imagine how Naruto felt about that. Fine, let's go. Of course, the Jonin said with a hidden smile. After we get something in your stomach, and say hello to your other teammate. You forgot to ask how her fight went. Shame on you, Sasuke. Sasuke glared. It was an incredibly isolating feeling, not being able to talk to anyone. With both Naruto and Sasuke out of commission, he was left bodiless, almost adrift, watching events happen. The ninja had combed the compound, looking for signs of habitation other than the two boys, and finding nothing other than his katana, which to his chagrin, they had taken for examination. The other Uchiha did not talk to Nabeshin. They lamented over their loss, some stuck in a constant state of terror or despair. He did not want to confer with Fugaku, he was still pissed at the man. There were other ghosts outside of the compound, many in fact, most fallen ninja from a war or two, several he actually knew. But they all seemed disconnected with what was happening around them except for whatever it was that had caused them their death, or a loved one. Currently he was watching an older man follow a teenaged girl around the marketplace. The girl was with a youth about her age. They were clearly on a date, and the older man was occasionally glaring at the object of her affection. A dead pervert? He had thought for a moment, but he realized they had the same nose and eyes, and she must be his daughter. He followed her everywhere, walked through people and objects without noticing them, a single-mindedness that seemed to plague everyone but him. What made him so different? The older man stopped suddenly, eyes turning to look off in another direction intently, and Nabeshin followed his eyes, looking into the crowd of living people. They all seemed the same, an assortment of colors and life, moving about their business. People began to move out of the way, a look of alarm or disgust on their faces. Out of them came Naruto. The blonde's black hood was down, for one, revealing a thin, dirty face, with limp dirty hair. In one hand was a sheathed katana, and on his dirty face was a very eerie smile. The eyes were still a beacon of red light, but for some reason, it seemed even worse to look upon. But wasn't Naruto in the hospital? As he came near, Nabeshin immediately noticed the sweater, the black one. Naruto did not have that one anymore. A clone, he breathed, and the clone paused as it was about to pass beyond him, turning those beacons of red light on him. Nabeshin flinched, but spoke. How come you are still here? The clone tilted its head to the side, smile remaining, beacons focused on him. Why are we not still here? We are to observe, and observing we have been, and observing we will continue to do. There was a smell emanating from the clone, dried blood. Something was seriously not right with this clone. Will you observe a message for me to Sasuke? He needs to be very careful from here on out. There are some strange umbu in the compound looking about. Something about these ones doesn't seem right. Both he and Naruto need to tread softly. Observing, the clone replied, seeming unaware of the looks he was getting from the villagers. It did seem as if he was talking to himself. The clone continued on, seeming undisturbed by Nabeshin's words. He began to wonder if Sasuke would ever get his message at all. Damn, he needed a body. but he wouldn't dare try to take that one. It irked him that Kakashi-sensei could wield the Sharingan better than him, a pure-blooded natural-born Uchiha, while he, having acquired it from a deceased teammate, had no relation at all. He had asked the Jonin how he had gotten the eye, and the man's answer had been short and to the point. It was as Naruto surmised, it had been transferred over. Interestingly enough, the eye was always activated, and pulled much chakra from the man if not covered. Sasuke had already been pushed to his own limits with the Sharingan, able to only keep it up for 10 minutes before it deactivated, leaving him drained and low on chakra as he limped back to the compound. And yet he could not hold back the smirk on his face. Kakashi-sensei had shown him an intriguing technique earlier, the Chidori. He glanced down at his stiff, reddened right palm, and he knew that by the time the semi-finals arrived, he would achieve it. He was determined to, even if it drained him faster than using the Sharingan did, even if, by what the Jonin had said, he would only be able to execute it once. Sasuke opened the gates to the compound and slipped through, a strange mixture of gladness and oppression coming over him as he took in the sight of the empty compound. It still surprised him every once in a while that he had actually returned here. He halted, thoughts abruptly stopping when his eyes fell on the porch of the main house. Was that Naruto standing there? How had he gotten out of the hospital? Sasuke began walking quickly up to the house but slowed down again as he got close enough to properly see him, and noticed many of the things that rang bells of alarm through him. First, he was wearing that sweater Kairi had given him, which he knew the blonde no longer had. Second, he had the hood down, which he rarely ever allowed, and his hair looked oily and grey with dirt. And he was just standing there, his back to the door. "Hey," Sasuke said, not too loudly, because the creepy grin that was turned on him was rather disquieting. The eyes, though smudged with weariness and red-rimmed, seemed unusually bright, happy-looking. Naruto didn't do happy wasn't something he normally felt. At least Sasuke had never seen the blonde truly happy. Oh, there were the times that Naruto got those crazy eyes and smile, but he knew that wasn't something natural to him. He knew about the fox. But this Naruto looked happy. And he was holding their katana against his chest. "Are those?" "We observed them," the familiar raspy voice replied as he came up to the porch. Sasuke immediately covered his nose. The smell coming from this Naruto was awful. He smelled like a dead animal. The Naruto handed the blades to him. "You left them behind." A chill. Why were the clones Naruto made a week ago still active? "How dash," he began, but the clone cut him off, taking a step toward him. Sasuke took a step back. "Nabeshin wanted us to observe that there are Umbu in the compound looking for him." Sasuke's eyes darted around warily. "You can see him." The clone took another step forward. Sasuke took another back, stifling a yelp when his back hit the door. "We have observed that Kakashi and the one named Yamanaka Inoichi put us in the hospital." The smell was awful, but Sasuke forgot all about it upon those words. "What? How?" "An ambush," the clone said. "They saw us talking to Nabeshin and attacked." "What? How could they have seen a GH? But wait, Nabeshin had been in one of Naruto's clones the last time he had seen him, and he was likely hunged as himself. And when he no doubt dispelled the clone he was occupying, everything he had done was returned to Naruto, and any other clone." Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Who knew Nabeshin by sight? Had Kakashi or this Inoichi known him when he was alive? Had he said anything incriminating? And how dare they attack Naruto? Do they know anything? He demanded, and the clone continued to smile. "They are observing, as we are observing. But they know very little." The clone took another step forward, until it was right up in his face, though Naruto was a few inches shorter than he. The smile had completely disappeared. "We are all observing Sasuke." He was being stared at deeply, and for some reason, those words sounded like a warning, or a threat. He found himself clutching the katana to his chest like a little girl. The cheerful smile returned to the clone's face as it stepped away and moved off the porch. "What have you been killing?" Sasuke asked suddenly. The clone continued to walk, glancing back at him as it rounded a corner. "Many things." Its raspy voice drifted back to him as it rounded a corner and disappeared. The room was comfortably stuffy, familiar, with all his things in it, but Sasuke could not sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling for hours into the night, but knew it was useless. He wasn't used to sleeping alone. He wasn't used to an empty room. Sasuke sighed, sitting up in bed, throwing his feet over the side and rubbing his neck where both seals were. Why bother trying? He got up, pulling on some pants and grabbing the stack of neatly piled newspaper and tape, stuffing it under one arm as he left the house. Outside the night was cool, but slightly humid, a calm night, probably with many umbu lurking around. He did not doubt the word of the clone. He believed he was being watched. He simply couldn't see his watchers. What if they were the ones that conspired against his clan? An angry thought. Sasuke stepped into the brightly lit hospital, surprised to see people walking about 3 in the morning, patients, nurses and doctors alike. He made it to Naruto's room without being harassed and went inside, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Naruto was still strapped and tubed, still obviously drugged into oblivion. Sasuke shook his head as he moved to the windows and quietly newspapered them up for Naruto, for when they stopped drugging him and he was completely lucid again. Satisfied that there were no cracks or spaces in between, Sasuke set the remaining newspaper and tape aside and pulled the chair next to Naruto's bed. He slumped down in it, curling up with his legs to his chest, and looked at his sore hand. Soon, perhaps even tomorrow, he would perfect the Chidori. Soon, Naruto would wake and he would get the full story of what had happened. Soon. Several minutes later, he was asleep, unaware of the ghost standing behind him. That's it for part 6. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.